We need that Royal Commission, that national inquiry into our COVID pandemic response, and we need it quickly. It's absolutely essential, underscored today by the startling revelations about the Victorian Labor government. Now, we tend to forget too quickly, don't we? But remember, it was only 18 months ago that Victorian Premier Daniel Andrews was announcing stuff like this.
There will be a curfew on advice from the Chief Health Officer from 9 p.m. to 5 a.m. each and every day. Exercise is just that. It's not an opportunity for 7 families to catch up in the park. It's exercise. So it's you and one other person from your household or dependents. There will be no removal of masks to consume alcohol outdoors. So you will no longer be able to remove your mask to drink a cocktail at a pop-up beer garden on a footpath as part of a pub crawl. Playgrounds, basketball courts, skate parks and exercise equipment, despite the fact that it's outdoors, will be closed.
What were we doing? Well, now we know that Daniel Andrews and his team spent $2 million of taxpayers' money on polling to get political and communications advice on spin during the height of the pandemic, when it was locking down Victorians, shutting schools and even, as you heard, playgrounds, and imposing curfews, and was telling everyone it was only following the medical advice. Hats off to Damon Johnson at the Australian newspaper who broke this story, pursuing it through freedom of information laws for years. The polling was conducted by Kudos, a company run by one of the Premier's Labor mates, John Armitage. All this exposes and confirms what many of us suspected, that so much of the response was motivated by politics, and it played to public fears rather than tried to quell them, elevating politics above practical outcomes, medical advice and personal liberty. Have a look at the Kudos advice about the Premier during the crisis. It talks about the government and the Premier in particular being seen as doing the right thing to get on top of a COVID spike. And it talks about the actions taken reinforcing the competence brand already well established, even with the knowledge of poor hotel quarantine. Given the government controlled the information, is it any wonder that the research shows the government's own message was being reflected back? Anyway, that's really political stuff there, really political advice. Taxpayers' money providing personal political advice to the Premier. But what about the medical advice? Weren't all these decisions taken because they had to be taken on the medical advice? Remember, we were told there was no room for politics, no room for consideration really, just blanket reliance on medical advice.
But when you get medical advice, you have to follow it. When the data tells you a really clear story, then you have to follow that. You've got to do what's required, whether it's popular or not. And that's what we've done all this year. This is not a popularity contest, it's a pandemic, and we all have to do our best.
Really? OK, so let's look at more Kudos advice. It talks about people supporting the introduction of tougher restrictions as they see something had to be done because daily case numbers weren't going down enough on the stage 3 restrictions. And then again, most people seem to take the overnight curfew in their stride and see it as a minor imposition and just another sensible tightening of restrictions in response to the crisis. So forget the medical advice, right? This is a government testing the waters, seeing what it can get away with, what will make it seem strong and competent. Outrageously, this uses the public fear that the government creates to justify more restrictions, which in turn, no doubt, generate more fear. Just think about it. The government put the fear of God into people, locked them down, and then surveyed them to find out that, yes, they're scared and now they'll accept even tougher measures. What a cynical and deceptive process. And all along this process, the government pretended it was only acting on medical advice. Just because nervous Nellies who love staying home are happy to accept a curfew, what justification is that for inflicting the curfew on other people, people whose lives were disrupted? Governments are supposed to do what's right, not what the nervous Nellies want or will let them get away with. And all the while, Daniel Andrews was imposing these onerous and cruel rules. He was getting this taxpayer-funded political research and advice while telling people something entirely different.
It is not leadership to do what is popular in the short term. Leadership is doing what is right. And whether I'm criticised or praised, that is not my concern. My concern is to defeat this second wave.
He pretended he didn't care what was popular. He pretended the politics didn't matter, while he was spending taxpayers' money finding out what was popular and what would fly. The cynicism is just unbelievable. But listen to how he justifies it today.
Well, when you've got a very difficult message to send, very difficult story to tell, and you want people to comply with rules that are deeply unpopular, deeply disruptive, then you need to test and make sure that you've got your messaging right. There's nothing more or less than that.
This wasn't just about messaging. This shows it wasn't all about the medical advice either. Medical advice, by the way, we've never seen. This shows us the raw politics behind these social experiments in lockdowns and curfews. I remind you, Melbourne was the most locked-down city in the world. And despite all its rules and its laws and its cruelty, Melbourne and Victoria performed worst in this country when it comes to COVID deaths. Toughest measures, worst results. I've been calling for a full National Royal Commission into the pandemic response for more than a year now. It needs to examine state and federal decisions. It needs to weigh up the claims against the facts, the outcomes against the intentions, and the costs against the benefits. Most politicians don't want one because they know they'll be in the frame, Labor and Liberals, state and federal. And most in the media run dead on this stuff too because most media has been complicit, too eager to instill fear, too timid to challenge government. Write to your local MP. Put the pressure on. We've got to have a full inquiry, a full Royal Commission.